What if the part of you that yells at your child isn't really you? What if the sharp words, the emotional shutdowns, the moments when you lose control aren't coming from the parent you want to be, but from the child you used to be? There's a reason some moments with our children feel bigger than they should. A tantrum, a slammed door, a look of defiance. And suddenly it's not just about them. Something inside you ignites. Your body tenses, your chest tightens. You feel yourself unravel. And later, when it's quiet again, you're left wondering, why did I react like that? This is where the real story begins, and it doesn't start with your child, it starts with the child inside you. Every adult carries the echo of who they were when they were small, not just in memories, but in the nervous system, in the way we flinch, freeze, lash out, or shut down. That part of us, the one shaped before we had language for our pain, is what psychologists call the inner child. And in parenting, it never stays silent for long. When your child cries too loud or asks too many questions or pushes a boundary you didn't know was sacred, your inner child might hear something else entirely. A threat, a shame trigger, an invisible replay of a moment you never got to resolve. What you felt at 5 years old, powerless, dismissed, unloved, didn't vanish with time. It became buried, and it waits. It waits for a moment that looks just familiar enough. It waits for your child's anger to resemble your father's. It waits for your toddler's crying to mimic your own that went unanswered. And when that moment comes, it doesn't whisper. It screams. You're not failing as a parent because you lose your temper. You're being shown a doorway into the parts of yourself that are still raw, still hurting, still holding on. These moments aren't accidents, they're invitations. And yet most people never walk through that door. They discipline harder, they detach, they perform parenting from the surface while underneath the past is pulling the strings. Carl Jung once said, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their children than the unlived life of the parent." That unlived life isn't always about ambition or career. Sometimes it's the part of you that was never allowed to feel, never allowed to grieve, never allowed to be a child. What we don't heal, we repeat, not because we want to, but because the pain we refuse to face becomes the pattern we unconsciously pass on. This is not your fault, but it is your opportunity, because here's the truth that could change everything. When you find the courage to meet your inner child, to see them, hear them, hold them, you don't just become more self-aware, you become safer. Not just for yourself, for your children. You become the adult who can pause, who can breathe, who can see a tantrum, not as defiance, but as dysregulation, not as manipulation, but as a mirror reflecting a part of you that still aches. This is where real parenting begins, not with techniques, not with perfect routines, but with presence, with the willingness to say the pain ends here. Because when you heal the child within, you stop asking your child to carry what you never meant to hand them. Inside every grown man is a boy who was told to stay quiet. Inside every grown woman is a girl who was told to be smaller. And inside nearly all of us is a child who was never told, "You matter." Just as you are, that child doesn't disappear. They don't grow up with the body. They linger, waiting, not for perfection, just for recognition. Carl Jung called this part of us the eternal child, an unfinished becoming part of the psyche that needs unceasing attention. It's the side of us that laughs too loud, cries too quickly, fears abandonment, avoids conflict, or overachieves to feel worthy. It's the one who learned long ago what was acceptable and what must be buried. John Bradshaw believed this wounded inner child is the single greatest source of adult dysfunction, not because it's weak, but because it's unacknowledged. And what we ignore rules us. You can see it in the parent who panics every time their child cries, the one who over-explains, over-controls, or overreacts. Not because they're bad parents, but because their nervous system is responding to a wound, not a moment, a memory, not a tantrum, And here's where most people get it wrong. They try to parent from knowledge, not from healing. They try to fix the outer behavior while avoiding the inner battlefield. They buy books, they follow scripts, but what their child needs is their presence. And presence only happens when the past stops hijacking the present. This isn't theoretical, it's measurable. Studies show that a parent's unresolved trauma can predict their child's attachment style even when that trauma is never spoken aloud. Children pick up on unprocessed emotion the way they pick up on tone, tension, silence. They learn what isn't said even more than what is. Alice Miller once wrote, "The more we idealize the past and refuse to acknowledge our childhood sufferings, the more we pass them on unconsciously to the next generation." In other words, pretending it didn't hurt doesn't protect your child, it programs them. But here's the redemption arc. What happened to you as a child is not your fault, but what you do with it now, that's where your power begins. The inner child isn't asking you to fix the past, they're asking to be met, to be seen, to be held with compassion, maybe for the first time. And when you begin to do that, not just once, but daily, in quiet moments, in reflection, in breath, you begin to change. The reactions soften, the urgency fades, the shame dissolves, not because you've become better, but because you've become more whole. And this is what your child feels, not your performance, your presence, not your knowledge, your nervous system. There's a kind of calm that only comes from facing yourself, and once you touch that calm, your parenting changes, not because you're trying harder, but because the frightened child within you no longer needs to run the show. You're home now, and your inner child knows it, and that means your child will too. Before psychology gave us diagnoses and frameworks, stories gave us truth. And one of those truths still whispers to us, wrapped in feathers and sorrow. A young bird is born into the wrong nest. From the moment he opens his eyes, he is told he's too awkward, too strange, too much. The other birds mock him, exclude him, remind him with every glance that he doesn't belong. So he leaves, he wanders alone. Season after season, his reflection in the water brings only shame, until one day he sees himself for what he truly is. A swan, beautiful, powerful, worthy. This isn't just the ugly duckling, it's the story of every inner child who learned to survive by becoming invisible. It's the story of you, if you were ever told that your tears were dramatic, that your needs were inconvenient, that your joy was too loud. Somewhere along the line you started to believe them. You traded truth for belonging, and like the duckling, you confused rejection with identity. But healing is the moment you recognize the lie, the moment you say, I was never the problem, I was always a swan raised among those who couldn't see. That story matters because it mirrors something deeper than memory. It mirrors the feeling so many parents carry, the sense that their child's big emotions are triggering something far older than the moment itself, a cry that echoes too loudly. A defiance that feels like betrayal, and underneath it all, a whisper, I felt this before. When that whisper comes, most of us don't pause. We push it away. We snap. We retreat. We react. But in those moments, we're not reacting to our child. We're reacting to the child we once were, and that's why stories matter, because they give us the language for what logic can't always explain. They remind us that our wounds are not signs of weakness, they're signposts. They point to where we've been abandoned and where we need to return. Charles Dickens understood this. In A Christmas Carol, we don't meet Scrooge's heart in the present, we meet it in the past. As a boy left alone in a schoolhouse over Christmas, forgotten, unloved. When the older Scrooge sees that boy again, he doesn't scold him, he weeps. And it's in that weeping, in that confrontation with his forgotten self, that his redemption begins. We think healing is about moving forward, but often it's about turning around and walking back into the schoolhouse, back into the memory, back into the version of you that got left behind when life demanded you grow up too fast. And when you meet that version of you, not to judge, not to analyze, but simply to say, I remember you, something begins to shift. A parent once shared this story. Her toddler threw a tantrum in the grocery store. It wasn't the first, but this time something broke open. Not in her child, in her. She wasn't angry, she was overwhelmed, not by the noise, but by the memory of how her own mother had humiliated her in public, how she'd been slapped, shamed, silenced. And for the first time, this mother didn't punish the behavior. She knelt down, she held her daughter close. And in that embrace, it wasn't just her daughter who was comforted. It was the little girl inside her who had never been held. This is what makes healing so sacred. You don't just change how you parent, you change who gets to be present. And that presence is the difference between passing on pain and passing on peace. Your child doesn't need you to be flawless, but they do need you to be whole. And wholeness begins when you stop ignoring the cry that isn't coming from the child in front of you, but from the one within. Some wounds don't need words, they need presence. There is a conversation many of us never had. No one said, "You're safe now." No one said, "I believe you." No one said, "You didn't deserve that." So we stopped expecting it, and over time we convinced ourselves we were fine. But silence is not the same as healing, and one day your child screams or breaks something or sobs so hard their whole body shakes, and something inside you responds too quickly, too sharply, too much, and you don't know why. That moment isn't random, it's a summons. The inner child is still there, not buried in the past but folded into the present, waiting, and now you get to do what was never done. You get to have the conversation that never happened. Close your eyes, breathe. Picture yourself at the age when something first started to hurt. Maybe it was when you were left alone too long, or when you learned to stop asking for things, or when someone made you feel small and it stuck. See that child, watch how they sit, what they're wearing, what their face looks like. Now walk toward them, not with judgment but with love, not to lecture but to listen. You don't have to fix them, they're not broken, they're just waiting. Waiting for someone to say, "I see you, I'm sorry, you didn't deserve that, I'm here now." Maybe they cry, maybe they look away, maybe they don't trust you yet. That's okay, stay. The healing doesn't happen in the words, it happens in the staying. And when you stay long enough, something begins to shift. That child who once felt unlovable begins to soften. The adult who once felt reactive begins to breathe. You start noticing a pause where there used to be panic, a tenderness where there used to be tension. This is the power of reparenting, not in theory, but in practice, not a performance, but a posture. When you comfort your inner child, you rewire your nervous system, you stop reacting from fear and start responding from love, and that shift, though invisible, becomes palpable in your home. Your child doesn't know what you've been through, but they feel what you've made peace with. And when they cry, you don't just tolerate it, you meet it. Not because you've memorized the right response, but because you've rehearsed it in the quiet with yourself. The practice is simple. 5 minutes a day, one deep breath, one mental embrace, one gentle reminder, "I've got you now." And in that ritual, the ghosts quiet down, the shame begins to lift. The urgency melts. You become the parent you needed, the one who stays, the one who listens, the one who never turns away. And because of that, your child doesn't inherit your silence, they inherit your healing. There are things we inherit that never show up in our DNA. Fear, silence, hypervigilance, the instinct to disappear when things get loud, the need to overachieve just to feel safe. These aren't just traits, they're adaptations. They're the residue of pain we never fully processed. And whether we speak of them or not, they find their way into our parenting. We like to believe children only learn what we teach, but they absorb what we embody. They don't hear our intentions, they feel our tension, and science backs this up in ways that are impossible to ignore. Studies in attachment theory have shown that a parent's unresolved trauma doesn't just live in their mind, it lives in their nervous system, and that nervous system becomes the emotional climate a child grows up in. One study using brain imaging found that mothers with unresolved childhood trauma had significantly lower activity in the regions of the brain responsible for empathy and emotional regulation when exposed to their own infant's cries, not because they didn't love their child, but because their past pain created a kind of emotional static. They couldn't hear the present clearly through the echoes of what still hurt, but there's more. Another long-term study revealed something extraordinary. Parents who had suffered neglect or abuse as children but had done the work to reflect, process, and integrate their experiences, those who had made sense of their story, had children with secure attachment patterns, not sometimes, consistently. This means trauma is not a sentence, it's a signal. And if you answer it, if you do the inner work, you don't just change yourself. You protect your children from having to inherit what you never chose to carry in the first place. The researchers called this earned secure attachment, and it doesn't come from having had a perfect childhood. It comes from the courage to face what was imperfect and to choose differently. One therapist described it this way: when you do the work of healing, you become a buffer between your children and the pain you lived through. You become a firewall between generations. You stop the transmission. You become the one who turns toward instead of away, and the effects go beyond emotion. Children raised by parents who've done this work tend to show stronger emotional regulation, more resilience under stress, and a greater capacity for empathy. Because healing isn't theoretical, it's physiological. It's in the tone of your voice, the softness of your eyes, the steadiness of your presence. It's in the moment you don't scream when you would have. The pause that wasn't there before, the hug that comes instead of the door slam. The breath you take when your child says something that used to trigger every unresolved thing inside you. And this time you don't flinch. You respond, you stay. This is the real legacy, not perfection, not performance, but presence. When you heal, your children inherit your calm instead of your chaos, your understanding instead of your confusion, your integration instead of your fragmentation. You don't have to be a perfect parent to break a cycle. You just have to be a conscious one. And the good news, you already are. The fact that you're here, listening, caring enough to wonder what lies beneath your reactions, that's the beginning. And it's a beginning your child will benefit from every single day. A healed parent doesn't raise a perfect child. They raise a free one, free from the burden of carrying wounds that don't belong to them, free to feel without fear, free to express without shame, free to grow without having to shrink. This is what your inner child has been waiting for, and what your actual child needs most. There's a kind of strength that doesn't come from dominance or discipline. It comes from depth, from having gone into the places that once scared you, and coming back with a softness the world tried to steal. You become the parent who doesn't just know how to manage emotions, but who models what it looks like to feel them safely. You become the adult who doesn't need to be right, but who chooses to be present. You become the person your younger self needed, and your child gets the benefit. Not a perfect home, but a safe one. Not a flawless relationship, but an honest one. Not a parent who never gets triggered, but a parent who knows what to do when they are. This doesn't happen all at once. Healing is not a straight line. It's a returning, again and again, to that quiet place inside you, to the breath, to the child within. You begin to notice the small victories, the meltdown that didn't escalate, the bedtime that ended with laughter instead of yelling, the hard conversation that didn't become a power struggle, the moment you saw the fear in your child's eyes and didn't mirror it. You met it with love. And in those moments, you're not just parenting, you're rewriting a legacy. Because when your inner child is no longer fighting for attention, your actual child gets all of you. Not the version shaped by trauma, but the version shaped by healing. And that version is magnetic, not because it's loud, but because it's real. You won't need to shout to be heard. You won't need to force to be respected. You'll lead through connection, not control, through presence, not perfection, and maybe, just maybe, your child will grow up with a story different from yours. Not because their life is easier, but because their parent chose to do the inner work. That's the legacy. That's the quiet revolution. And if this spoke to you, if it reached something deep inside, don't keep it to yourself. There is someone you love who needs to hear this too, someone carrying the same silence, someone parenting through the same invisible pain. Share it, speak it, begin. Because every time one of us chooses to turn inward, to do the hard, unseen work of healing, another child gets to grow up in a home where safety is real, and that changes everything.